Hey everybody, hope you're killing it. Am I recording? God, I'm incompetent. This is chapter 7 of, let's try this. Svetozar Stojanović, Between Ideals and Reality, a Critique of Socialism and Its Future. Chapter 7 is titled The Ethical Potential of Marx's Thought. And it's the first chapter of part 3 of the book, which is titled Heights and Depths of Morality. Section 1. A Marxist ethics, at least one worthy of Marx's name, has yet to be constructed. Does this problem exist because of obstacles inherent in Marx's thought itself, or perhaps simply because of certain external circumstances, such as the immaturity of Marx's followers? The following lines written by Antonio Labriola show that some Marxists have not even understood the ethical problem in Marxism. Quote, ethics and idealism consist henceforth in this, to put the thought of science at the service of the proletariat. If this ethics does not appear moral enough for the sentimentalist, usually hysterical and silly, let them go and borrow altruism from its high priest Spencer, who will give them a vague and insipid definition of it, such as will satisfy them. End quote. Labriola, Essays on the Materialistic Conception of History. End quote. An examination of the reasons which might account for the non-existence of a Marxist ethics is a precondition for any more complete evaluation of Marx's philosophy. One of the criteria for evaluating a body of thought is its capacity of embracing all the key problems of man. It is not good for it to remain powerless before the moral dimension of social life. How could it have happened that a revolutionary movement whose goal was the realization of the most radical humanistic ideals still lacks a developed ethics? To this very day, Marxists have argued more about the causes of the undeveloped state of their ethics than they have worked to develop one. Two reasons are commonly put forward for this, one socio-political, the other socio-psychological. The state of the workers' movement, social democratic as well as communist, is usually cited as the first reason. Indeed, if, quote, the ultimate aim of socialism is nothing but the movement is everything, end quote, it is difficult to find a place for ethics. And that quote is from Bernstein. On the other hand, Stalinism and contemporary Maoism have made a caricature of Marxist ethics. Ethical theorists become the apologists of state policy. The second, socio-psychological factor usually advanced to explain the lack of a Marxist ethics is the tendency of Marxists to postpone the formulation of a positive program in times of revolutionary action. To this is usually added the observation that, although in 1844 he did intend to write a book on ethical problems, Marx himself did not have enough time to work on ethics. Marx, however, used his time for what he thought was more important. But if Marx did not have the time, this surely cannot be said of many of his followers. Nevertheless, to this very day, we have not come upon a satisfactory Marxist ethics. A more complete explanation, apparently, will have to be sought in certain theoretical obstacles inherent in Marxist thought itself. Throughout the history of Marxism and Marxology, there have been two conflicting interpretations of Marx, ethical and aethical. This writer represents the view that his thought contains an ethical values which can serve as a point of departure for our Marxist ethics. But Marx also gave occasion for the contrary, an aethical interpretation. The ambivalence creates difficulties for any Marxist-oriented philosophy of morals. In addition, however, there is one more significantly larger obstacle, i.e. Marx's understanding of historical determinism. Section 2. What evidence is there for those who claim that Marx's work has absolutely no ethical content? Marx asserted that he had emerged from the province of speculation into the realm of, quote, real positive science, end quote. Marx. Marx was attempting to establish a scientific socialism as opposed to the moralizing utopian socialism which had existed previously. Partisans of the aethical interpretation of Marx's thought usually refer to the following or similar passages. Quote, communism cannot preach any kind of morality at all, something that Stirner does altogether too much. They cannot pose any kind of moral demands at all to people. Love one another, do not be egoists, etc. On the contrary, they know very well that egoism, just as well as self-sacrifice, is, in specific conditions, a necessary form of individual self-affirmation. End quote. German ideology. Quote, communism is for us not a stable state which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. End quote. Marx, German ideology. Quote, law, morality, religion are to it, bracket, the proletariat, end bracket, so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests, end quote. Marx. Quote, Communist Manifesto. Quote, morality is, quote, impotence in action, end quote. Every time one struggles with some vice, it is defeated. But Rudolph can not even raise himself to the standpoint of independent morality, which is based at least upon human dignity. To the contrary, his morality bases itself upon consciousness of human weakness. Rudolph's morality is theological, end quote. Marx, the German ideology. In his letter to Engels of November 4th, 1864, Marx complained that the Mazzinists had forced him to throw two phrases into the preamble of the statutes of the International about, quote, duty and right, end quote, as well as about, quote, truth, morality, and justice, end quote, but added that in such a place they would do no damage. In his letter to Zorga of October 19, 1877, Marx complained about those people who wanted to, quote, replace its, bracket, socialisms, and bracket, materialistic basis, which demands serious objective study from anyone who tries to use it, by modern mythology and its goddesses of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, end quote. Marx. The group which interprets Marx as an aethical thinker include Werner Sombart, Benedetto Croce, Karl Kautsky, Max Adler, Rudolf Hilferding, and the Neo-Kantians, Lucien Goldman, and others. I don't think the way I said that made it sound like Lucien Goldman was part of the Neo-Kantians. I don't think that's what he's the intention of the actual sentence. Some of them hold that the absence of an ethical position is a shortcoming of Marx's thought, and therefore seek to supplement Marx with Darwin, Kautsky, Darwin and Kant, Ludwig Voltmann, or Kant, the Neo-Kantians. Section 3. Opposed to the group described above is an entire succession of theorists who think that Marx's thought has ethical content. Edward Bernstein, Maximilian Rubel, Karl Popper, John Lewis, Eugene Kamenka, and others. Once again, I have cited non-Marxists as well as Marxists. This second group embraces both those who believe that Marx's doctrine is purely ethical and non-scientific, and those who claim that it is ethical only in one of its dimensions and scientific in the other. They also rely upon many passages from Marx. For example, quote, the criticism of religion ends with the doctrine that man is the supreme being for man. Man is the supreme being for man. It ends therefore with the quote, it ends therefore with the categorical imperative to overthrow all those conditions, in which man is an abased, enslaved, abandoned, contemptible being. End quote. Marx. Quote, the social principles of Christianity preach cowardice, self-contempt, abasement, submission, humility, in short, all the qualities of the Canaille, I don't know if I'm saying that, or Canaille, Canaille, while the proletariat, not wanting to be treated as Canaille, or Canaille, needs its courage, pride, and sense of independence much more than its daily bread. End quote. Marx. Quote, the standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. The standpoint of the new is human society, or socialized humanity. End quote. Marx, Thesis 10 on Feuerbach. Marx pleaded for a society, quote, in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, end quote. Communist Manifesto. In the same doctrine, Marx often used ethical expressions such as, quote, naked self-interest and callous cash payment, end quote, quote, oppression, quote, degradation of personal dignity, quote, shameless, direct, and brutal exploitation, end quote, quote, inconsiderateness, quote, the modern slavery of capital, quote, subjugation, quote, the masses of workers are slaves, end quote, and so on. Marx's Capital, especially chapters 4, 7, and 23 of the first volume, is also permeated with ethically colored formulations. So is the following passage from The Poverty of Philosophy concerning capitalism, quote, this is the time when the very things which till then have been communicated but never exchanged, given but never sold, acquired but never bought, virtue, love, conviction, knowledge, conscience, etc., when or everything in short passed into commerce, is the time of general corruption, of universal venality, end quote. Marx, Poverty of Philosophy. In his critique of the Gotha program, Marx compares bourgeois, socialist, and communist distribution of the social product, demonstrating the advantages of the communist mode of distribution proceeding from the principle of social equality. But there is no need to go on referring to passages from Marx's works. With the books by Marek Fritzhand, which I don't know if I have any pieces by him on the channel, and Eugene Kamenka, who I do have pieces from the channel because he was in Erich Fromm's compendium, Socialist Humanism compendium. With the books by Marek Fritzhand and Eugene Kamenka, in which Marx is quoted and analyzed in detail, I think that it has been definitively proven that Marx's thought has an ethical dimension. From his earliest through his latest works, Marx wrote as an heir of the great European humanistic ethical tradition. Many non-Marxist thinkers as well have conceded this point. How could it have been and still be that in the face of so many proofs to the contrary, there have been interpreters of Marx's thought who have claimed that it is aethical, and furthermore that it is not accidentally so, but rather aethical in its very essence? In this connection, as we have seen, these interpreters refer to Marx's statement about the scientific character of this work in some of his thoughts on morality. As final proof, they usually cite Marx's understanding of historical determinism, but we shall address ourselves to this topic in the second section. From Marx's belief in the scientific character of his own teaching, of course, it does not at all follow that this teaching was not ethically colored. The point is that Marx did not take, quote, science to mean, quote, value-free intellectual activity, which is what certain Marxologists have in mind when they speak of, quote, science. Marx never drew the kind of distinction between cognitive and value statements which would place the latter outside of the realm of science. We can never overlook the fact that Marx was a student of Hegel and that Hegel had rejected Kant's dualism because Hegel was convinced of the unity of the is and the ought of Sein and Sollen. Sein and Sollen. No passage quoted by adherents of the aethical interpretation of Marx proves convincingly that moral values remained external to the content of Marx's thought. On the contrary, there are many passages which prove the opposite. There is not a single passage of Marx that must be interpreted in such a manner as to show that he was hostile to morality, but there are quite a few which unquestionably express a strong aversion to the preaching of moral values. At first glance, it might seem as if the following lines, which we have already quoted above, are an exception to this point. Except an exception in this respect. Quote, law, morality, religion are to it, bracket, the proletariat, in bracket, so many bourgeois prejudices behind which lurk and ambush just as many bourgeois interests, end quote, Marx. But contextual analysis shows that this passage is hostile to the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie's invocation of morality rather than to morality as such. Why was Marx against the preaching of morality? This cannot be explained in terms of his personal moral qualities, as Karl Popper tries to do when Karl Popper writes, quote, Marx, I believe, avoided an explicit moral theory because Marx hated preaching. Deeply distrustful of the moralist who usually preaches water and drinks wine, Marx was reluctant to formulate his ethical convictions explicitly, end quote. Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Marx, for instance, had nothing against the personal moral standards of certain utopian socialists, but Marx criticized them nonetheless as he wanted to transcend moralizing socialism with scientific socialism. The moral preacher, according to Marx, operates on the assumption that, quote, a moral command to people to change their consciousness will really change their consciousness, end quote. Marx, the German ideology. The preacher is the personification of, quote, impotence in action, end quote. This is the reason Marx decided in favor of a scientific investigation of existing society and reliance upon those forces which are interested in changing existing society at existing society's very foundations. With complete devotion, Marx plunged into the task of establishing the regularities of capitalism and the forces which maintain capitalism, the possibilities and the tendencies pointing toward the transcendence of capitalism, as well as the task of discovering the identity of the agent of such revolution. Not believing in the efficacy of moral preaching, Marx insisted upon the need for radical changes in the social conditions which lead to immorality. Marx's humanism is neither moralizing nor even primarily moral, although it does contain the moral dimension as well. Instead, it is practical and revolutionary. This humanism attempts to penetrate to the cause of an inhuman social order and is not concerned primarily with consequences, unlike utopian socialism, which remains naive and powerless. Marx's humanism, rather than relying upon its moral appeal and influence, relies upon something else much more basic, the interest of the working class. The task of Marx's theory is to contribute to the awakening of the working class's consciousness of its own interests. Marx's intellectual position is not beyond moral values, but it is anti-moralistic. Every moralist gives precedence to a moral judgment rather than an examination of reality, and expects that this judgment in and of itself will move people to change reality. Moralism in practice corresponds to ethicism in theory. Marx did make moral judgments about capitalism, yet what was most important to Marx was scientific investigation into the nature of capitalism. In contrast to moralists, Marx held no illusions about the efficacy of moral judgments which do not coincide with real social interest. And although Marx evaluated capitalism from a humanistic standpoint, Marx did not feel the need to formulate and explicate the principles upon which Marx had based these judgments. Marx was a critic and an ethical critic at that, but he was not a systematic ethical theorist. Should it not be possible, however, for those people who seek to construct a Marxist ethics to try to explicate, systematize, evaluate, and employ his moral principles? This task is still no more than at its first stage, and no one has done more in this respect than M. Fritzhand, whom we have already mentioned. Marxists are heirs to the clearly anti-moralistic and anti-ethicist Marxists are heirs to the clearly anti-moralistic and anti-ethicist posture of Karl Marx. A Marxist ethics cannot consider its primary task to be to urge individuals to perfect themselves in a moral sense. A Marxist ethics must be the ethics of the revolutionary movement. Such an ethics finds its hope in moral revolution, but only as an aspect of social and even more broadly total humanist revolution. All this demands that a Marxist ethics be differentiated from classical normative ethics. Moreover, it should be recognized that Marxists have the best prospects of making new contributions in problems of social rather than individual ethics. Even so, they still cannot afford to lose sight of the ethical problems of the individual, such as, for instance, the meaning of life, happiness, love, hate, friendship, and so on. Section 4. That alongside his understanding of historical determinism, Marx also left a place for human praxis, freedom, and self-realization is demonstrated by many of Marx's texts, of which the following are illustrative. Quote, men make their own history, but men do not make their own history just as men please. Men do not make their own history under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. End quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. Quote, history is nothing but the succession of the separate generations, each of which exploits the materials, forms of capital, the productive forces handed down to it by all preceding ones, and thus on the one hand continues the traditional activity in completely changed circumstances, and on the other modifies the old circumstances with a completely changed activity. End quote. Marx, the German ideology. Quote, world history would indeed be very easy to make if the struggle were taken up only on condition of infallibly favorable chances. It would, on the other hand, be of a very mystical nature if, quote, accidents played no part. These accidents naturally form part of the general course of development and are compensated by other accidents, but acceleration and delay are very much dependent upon such, quote, accidents. including the, quote, accident of the characters of the people who first head the movement, end quote. Marx, letter to L. Kugelmann, April 17, 1871. Still, Marx belonged to 19th century science, in which strict determinism of the natural science of the time was still the theoretical and methodological ideal for all sciences. It should also be taken into consideration that in his philosophy of history, Marx's mentor Hegel treated people as instruments of the objective spirit. All this had to have an impact upon Marx, who occasionally went to the extremes of absolute determinism. Quote, "My standpoint from which the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them." End quote. Marx, Capital, preface to the first German edition. Quote, "But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a law of nature, capitalist production's own negation," end quote. Marx, Capital. Marx approvingly quotes one of Capital's reviewers who had written, quote, "Consequently, Marx only troubles himself about one thing, to show by rigid scientific investigation the necessity of successive determinate orders of social conditions, and to establish, as impartially as possible, the facts that serve Marx for fundamental starting points. For this is quite enough, if Marx proves, at the same time, both the necessity of the present order of things and the necessity of another order into which the first must inevitably pass over, and this all the same, whether men believe or do not believe it, whether they are conscious or unconscious of it. Marx treats the social movement as a process of natural history governed by laws not only independent of human will, but rather on the contrary determining that will, consciousness, and intelligence. Marx treats the social movement as a process of natural history governed by laws not only independent of human will, but rather on the contrary determining that will, consciousness, and intelligence, ... end quote. Afterward to the second German edition. Author's emphasis, or Stojanović's emphasis. In the passage which follows, Marx advocates both strict determinism according to which social laws function with, quote, iron necessity, end quote, but at the same time a milder form of determinism as well, which treats laws as, quote, tendencies. Quote, intrinsically it is not a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms that result from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies working with iron necessity toward inevitable results. It is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies working with iron necessity toward inevitable results, end quote. Marx, Capital. And in the third volume of Capital, Marx again puts forth the view that a law is only a tendency which can be annulled by contradictory tendencies. Quote, and even when a society has got upon the right track for the discovery of the natural law of society's movement, and it is the ultimate aim of this work to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society, that society can neither clear by bold leaps nor remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of its normal development, but it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. No, Capital Volume 3. Yeah, I always thought that was a weird phrase in the book. It's like the law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Well, what does that mean? There are then two interweaving and inflicting motifs in Marx's writings. While people are the subjects of the historical process's course is independent of human consciousness and will. While man is a creative being, there is only one possible direction which history can take. While people can exert an influence upon historical events, people can exert such influence only upon the speed with which they take place, and not upon their general course. To be sure, this rule of blind historical forces over man was for Marx a sign that we are still in man's prehistory. To be sure, this rule of blind historical forces over man was for Marx a sign that we are still in man's prehistory. In communism, associated humanity would determine the course of history. Both as a philosopher and as a student of history, Marx had to give an account of the relationship between determinism and freedom. Experts on the history of human thought are aware that this is one of the so-called eternal philosophical problems, that the basic types of solutions have been outlined before the time of Marx, and that each of them has had its own powerful mode of argumentation and justification. Without being aware of it, Marx continuously vacillated between two mutually exclusive positions.
Sorry.
That's fine. Doesn't bother me. Consequently, two different orientations branched off from Marx, orientations which have trailed through the history of Marxism to the present day. The majority of the Marxists of the Second International understood Marx as a theorist of strict determinism. At the same time, such a Marx had to be seen as an aethical thinker. Naturally, those Marxists who felt the absence of ethics to be a shortcoming had to seek a supplement to Marx's thought in other philosophies, above all in the philosophy of Kant. Opposing himself to Western social democracy, Lenin gravitated toward the conception of Marx as a thinker of revolutionary historical creativity. However, it must be pointed out that Lenin did not take note of the contradiction in Marx's understanding of historical determinism. Moreover, Lenin himself restated the idea that communism is historically inevitable while at the same time maintaining an activist posture. One theory, Lenin often used severely deterministic language. In practice, Lenin firmly insisted upon revolutionary consciousness and creativity. Perhaps no social movement more than the communist movement has insisted so vigorously upon the inevitability of its own goal, and simultaneously upon the activism of organized fighters for that goal. Faith in the inevitability of socialism had a diverse psychological effect upon the international workers' movement. Social democrats have rather passively expected capitalism to gradually arrive at its final crisis, while Leninists have actively pursued the destruction of capitalism with a great deal of self-confidence. Stalinists, in order to reassure the Stalinist followers and render the Stalinist opponents powerless, have made masterful use of the psychological effect of the concept of the inevitability of socialism. Faith in the inevitability of socialism apparently also fortifies the Maoist conviction in the spirit of indeterminism, which the Maoists otherwise reject, that the determining nature of China's backwardness does not constitute an obstacle over which the organized masses cannot execute, quote, great leaps forward, end quote. Section 5. Assuming that Marx's occasional, extremely deterministic statements are true, that socialism is a historical inevitability and that people can only speed up or slow down its advent, in that case, is a Marxist ethics possible? The task of such ethics, among other things, would be to morally stimulate and obligate people to struggle for socialism. This effort of the ethical theorists, however, makes sense only if people can influence the course of history. Yet we have already quoted extensively from the Marx, according to whom people have a weak impact upon the historical process and therefore bear little responsibility for the outcome of this process. Precisely because Marx looked upon socialism as a historical inevitability, Marx did not feel the need to give an explicit ethical justification for socialism. Much less did Marx want to prescribe that people ought to try to bring about the triumph of socialism. This has led a few interpreters, Karl Popper, N.B. Mayo, George L. Klein, and others, to conclude that Marx took historical necessity as his ethical criterion. Since Popper's statement is the most fully elaborated, it seems most natural that Popper's statement should be presented and evaluated here. Popper characterizes Marx's position as, quote, moral positivism, end quote, or more precisely, quote, moral futurism, end quote, but immediately adds, quote, Marx, I assert, would not seriously have defended moral positivism in the form of moral futurism if he had seen that it implies the recognition of future might as right, end quote. Popper. Open Society and Its Enemies. As evidence for Popper's interpretation, Popper refers to the following passage from Engels, quote, that morality which contains the maximum of durable elements is the morality which, in the present, represents the overthrow of the present, represents the future, that is, the proletarian, end quote. Engels. Anti-Düring. But first of all, this passage does not prove that historical necessity was an ethical criterion of Engels, and secondly, even if it were to do this, this is Engels and not Marx. Popper did not quote Marx, and could not, because there are no passages in Marx's writing to justify such an interpretation. Popper read the ethical criterion implicit in Stalinism into Marx. That which triumphs in history is ipso facto moral. Robert C. Tucker rightly rejects Popper's interpretation, suggesting that Marx first arrived at the idea of a human society, only later rejected his convictions about its necessity. At this point, we might also take note of another rather convincing counterproof offered by Robert C. Tucker. It is hardly credible that anyone would be so disgusted by existing society to the extent that Marx was solely on the basis of the intellectual conviction that it would inevitably disappear and yield to communism. In my opinion, the idea of the humanistic foundation of communism led Marx psychologically to his conviction of communism's inevitability, and not conversely. As a great optimist, Marx was convinced that the historical process would necessarily lead to a human society. However, these two matters, the historical necessity and the humanistic justification of communism, were logically independent of each other in his mind. Because of its occasionally absolutely deterministic dimension, however, Marxist thought peculiarly does harm to the very cause it espouses. For a Marxist to be able to construct an ethics of revolutionary action, a Marxist must reject Marx's rigid determinism. Such determinism excludes human freedom, which is the ratio ascendi of morality and ethics. Many Marxists have accepted a milder variant of Marxist determinism, but it is by now high time to approach serious work on the formulation, development, and justification of this position. In Marxism, this point of view has merely been reiterated with minor variations, yet other non-Marxist philosophers have written many significant works on the problem of historical determinism and freedom. One could not say that they have solved this problem, of course, but it is certain that they have made a considerable degree of progress in both the presentation of the problem and the arguments of their positions. The model variant of determinism proceeds from the assumption that every historical situation bears within it more than one possibility, yet possibilities are not unlimited, contrary to what Marxists who have fallen under the influence of existentialism may think, for the framework of possibilities is defined by the historical level achieved. Human freedom consists of the power to choose one of these possibilities and to commit oneself to its realization. Only when man possesses this power of choice is he morally responsible for the course of history. An ethics of revolutionary action is possible only on the basis of faith in the relative openness of the future. However, even once one concludes that a Marxist ethics must renounce Marx's occasional absolute determinism, one need not in the least agree with Popper, who writes, quote, "Scientific Marxism is dead. Scientific Marxism's feeling of social responsibility and scientific Marxism's love for freedom must survive." End quote. Popper. Today, rigid determinism has been transcended in natural science as well as in social science, but even as science does not reveal inevitabilities in history, it is still capable of establishing historical possibilities and tendencies. Socialism is one of these real possibilities and tendencies, but hardly an inevitability. Whether or not it will be realized depends upon human beings. Only a Marxism which sees socialism as a possibility can ethically obligate them, and Marxists, to commit themselves to socialism's realization. After all the events of the past 100 years, it is no longer possible to believe in the inevitability of socialism. At least two fundamental changes have occurred since Marx's time. First, a new form of class prehistory, statism, has been created, a form which Marx did not foresee, and second, man has accumulated such destructive forces in his hands that not even the existence of humanity can be taken for a certainty, much less the movement of history in any particular direction. Today it is not only possible for mankind to pass over from prehistory into true history, it may also pass over into dehistory. What if it turns out that humanity has been trying to perform a task of Sisyphus? Or even worse, what if the stone destroys Sisyphus, and thus if the disappearance of the absurd is produced only at the price of the triumph of nothingness? Section 6. Marx took possession of the pre-existing store of humanistic ethical ideas into which, among others, the ideals of the great democratic revolutions had found their way and then radicalized, developed, and made it concrete. The humanistic ethical basis of this work is composed of the concepts of de-alienation, freedom, social equality, and justice. the abolition of exploitation, the disappearance of social classes, the withering of the state, the creation of self-managing associations of producers, and so on. No satisfactory socio-political ethics today can steer clear of these values. Marx's contribution to ethics must be sought in the radicalization and concretization of these values rather than in the formulation of a basic ethical criterion. To this day, many Marxists have tried to find confirmation of such a criterion in Marx's writings, but to no avail. At the first ethical criterion was sought in the abolition of exploitation in the interests of the proletariat, but one need not be very analytically minded to see that these principles cannot fulfill this role. Marx's concept of exploitation embraces only a small portion of the moral phenomenon, and it is for this very reason that the abolition of exploitation could not be an ethical criterion. The attempt of certain Marxists to understand exploitation in a much broader sense as any situation in which one person uses another to his own advantage, while avoiding the above-mentioned pitfall, introduces a second, no less dangerous one: excessive vagueness. Besides ethics, particularly a Marxist ethics, cannot simply demand that people eliminate a situation in which each takes advantage of the other, but must rather demand instead something much more, something positive. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like the thing, is like, just as a side note, I don't know enough about ethics to find, and I think this has a problem with vagueness, but the Kantian idea, the Kantian imperative to treat people always as ends in themselves and never merely as a means, right? That is a form of, I think that is kind of gets to the heart of the question, is that cooperation is an imperative and it's mutually beneficial, but that cooperation should not be done, cannot be done hierarchically or exploitatively, right? And you kind of are using people all the time, right? You use you're used and used by people all the time, which is great, as long as that's not it, Besides ethics, particularly a Marxist ethics, cannot simply demand that people eliminate a situation in which each takes advantage of the other, but must rather demand instead something much more, something positive. Lenin was in the habit of saying, quote, "We say that our morality is entirely subordinated to the interests of the proletariat's class struggle. Our morality stems from the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat," end quote. Lenin. But when suggested as an ethical criterion, the interest of the proletariat has unavoidable weaknesses. Above all, the very notion of interest is extremely vague, and even Marx himself decisively rejected all utilitarian ethics. Some theorists have sought the solution in the difference between the immediate and historical interests of the proletariat. It is generally recognized that Marx clearly discriminated in favor of the latter. For Marx, the proletariat's immediate interest was not even an unconditionally positive ethical value, much less a fundamental ethical criterion. The history of the proletariat and the proletarian movement indeed show how right Marx was to have a critical attitude towards its immediate interest. However, to take the historical interest of the proletariat as the ethical criterion is to be caught unawares in a vicious circle. Analysis of Marx's writings demonstrates that the historical interest, as distinguished from the immediate interest of the proletariat, includes, by definition, the realization of the humanistic ethical values enumerated above, thereby presenting us once more with the original question: which of these is the supreme ethical value that can serve as a basis for the supreme ethical criterion? This vicious circle is not so conspicuous as one within which Lenin was caught when he tried to define communist morality as that which, quote, serves to destroy the old exploiting society and to unite all the working people around the proletariat, which is building up a communist society, end quote. Lenin. For decades, Soviet ethicists have retracted this article. For decades, Soviet ethicists have retracted this circle, As illustration, I refer to Shishkin, Quote, Marxism-Leninism sees the highest criterion of communist morality in the struggle for communism, end quote. But under the influence of Stalinism, these ethicists went even, quote, further than Lenin by identifying the historical interest of the proletariat with the policies of their own communist party. They thus opened the door to the ethical degeneration of the party as well as of the revolution. More recently, certain Marxists have sought the supreme ethical criterion in de-alienation. This certainly represents theoretical progress, as the concept of de-alienation is more fundamental and complex. This certainly represents theoretical progress, as the concept of de-alienation is more fundamental and complex than that of either the abolition of exploitation or realization of the interests of the proletariat. But this effort as well has failed to produce any satisfactory results. In the second chapter of this book, we analyzed Marx's concept of de-alienation. On the formal level, de-alienation means the transcendence of the contradiction between human essence and human existence. On the level of content, the de-alienated person is creative, whole, free, sociable, multilaterally developed. When we analyze such a complex concept as that of de-alienation, that is to say, we find multiple values contained within it, once again posing the question from which we had started: which of these values is most fundamental, so that it may serve as the basic ethical criterion? Quote, creativity and, quote, wholeness, even at first glance, are unsatisfactory, because what we need is precisely a measure by which we can judge when a person, even in his creativity and wholeness, is moral and when he is not. Freedom, again, cannot be a moral criterion because it is a presupposition of morality. Freedom, again, cannot be a moral criterion because freedom is a presupposition of morality. Moral judgment presupposes moral responsibility, and moral responsibility presupposes freedom. Besides, freedom itself is subordinate to an ethical evaluation. There are abuses as well as uses of freedom, and it therefore cannot be a measure for such an evaluation. This means that only two of the above-mentioned notions remains: sociability and multilateral development of human potentials. In his previously cited book, Fritz Hand, after detailed analysis, extracts these two principles, the socialization and self-realization of man, as the axiological basis of Marx's work. But he did not succeed in finding one basic value in Marx which might serve as a rule of thumb when these two principles come into conflict. It is accurate to say that Marx was a sort of ethical perfectionist. He stood for the realization of every human potential which does not threaten man's social nature. But where is the border between the egoistic self-realization and the socialization which does not smother individuality? Where does the free development of every individual as a, quote, condition for the free development of all, end quote, end, and the development of an individual who threatens the freedom of others begin? How can we formulate a principle on the basis of which we can distinguish obligations of the free individual toward society from sociability which threatens human freedom? Yet if Marx cannot help us to solve the problem of the fundamental ethical criterion, Marx still did articulate some important thoughts concerning individual ethical values. This fact should be put to good use in the construction of a Marxist ethics. A Marxist ethical theorist, of course, cannot afford to dwell too long on the establishment and systematization of Marx's contribution to ethics. Even if he extends his scope to other socialist thinkers, which is undoubtedly necessary, he will still be no closer to a living ethics. Nothing can replace the critical analysis of the moral praxis of the revolutionary movement. Especially great prospects in this respect are offered by a humanistic ethical critique of Stalinism.